Welcome to World Care Center's Just-in-Time Flood Response and Safety. We'll be going over the muck and gut process, starting with assessment, muck out, mold suppression, moisture testing, rebuilding, and connecting survivors to the Long-Term Recovery Committee and the resources that exist within the community. We start by structuring our team using the incident command system and one of their most common tools, an incident command chart. As you can see here, we have one team leader, and beneath that team leader, we have a homeowner liaison, a safety officer, and a volunteer officer. That volunteer officer is managing up to 6 muck and gut volunteers. By using the incident command system, we're organizing the team, letting them know who they should be communicating to, how the reporting structure exists, and it also helps to see that our volunteer officer or any of the other officers are not managing too many people. It's important that anyone considering being a muck and gut volunteer consider whether they're a high-risk individual. Smokers are 50 to 70% more at risk than non-smokers to a variety of hazard exposures and effects in a muck and gut operation. Pregnant women, those with autoimmune deficiencies, heart conditions, asthma, allergies, and previous injuries that continue to affect their abilities should consider taking on a different role. We use several tools that help us understand what the environment is all about, the work that needs to be done, and the potential risks, and how to control them. Those tools are survivor's needs assessment, windshield assessment, hazard assessment, risk mapping, and hazard controls. A survivor's needs assessment can be conducted over the phone and often contains information from the homeowner's perspective, what they believe needs to be done, and the hazards they see. This can also be done by going door to door and generally doesn't include a thorough walkthrough. A windshield assessment is done pretty much exactly what it sounds like. Through the windshield of a car or a vehicle, looking at the area, seeing if there are any downed trees, electrical lines, or potential hazards entering into the area. A hazard assessment can be done at the same time as a walkthrough to see what needs to get done to complete the muck and gut job. An individual and their buddy should walk through the home, room by room, assess what work has to be completed, what tools are needed, and how many people per team are needed. While doing so, they're also looking for hazards such as chemicals, uneven floors, and potentially pets, snakes, and in some cases, crocodiles. A risk map is actually laying out the risks that exist in the area, putting it on paper onto a floor plan, and we'll take a look at that. You also have hazard controls, and those are the things that you're going to do to minimize or eliminate those hazards. So here's what a risk map looks like. You're using icons or symbols to identify physical and safety hazards, chemical hazards, biological and infectious hazards, ergonomic hazards, and stressors. This can be a simple sketch, as you can see here, room by room, where those hazards exist, so that you can figure out how to reduce them or eliminate them altogether. You also want to set up your workstation properly, taking a look at the home, where your exits are, and how you lay out a safety station, where you'll place garbage according to the rules and regulations of the town that you're working in. You might want a caution area where people will be throwing items out of the window, and you want to make sure that other volunteers aren't walking underneath that window. You might also want to put down a tarp to put items that need to be cleaned and saved. This is an example of a safety station or a clean zone. As you can see, there's several rinse buckets, and you have an eye wash station, drinking water, a first aid kit, and emergency phone numbers. Now that you're aware of the assessment tools, we want to remind you never to enter an area where floodwaters are still rising. You don't know how high they'll rise to, and you may become stuck in the area. You also want to be very careful and not enter moving water, as fast-moving undercurrents can sweep you off your feet. The waters can also be contaminated and contain items that have been washed up. There are several hazards in a muck and gut operation, including asbestos, lead, sewage, mold, silica, and chemicals, to name a few. Asbestos is used as an insulation and often exists in homes that are built pre-1976. As you do your walkthrough and risk assessment, you want to look for pipes and beams that have been covered by asbestos. Also, certain tiling. When you see a floor that has several layers with perhaps laminate on top of it with a tile underneath, you want to be cautious, as that tile underneath may be asbestos. When coming into contact with asbestos, you never want to disturb it. You want to take a visual and then cordon off the area, perhaps even put sheeting up, and tell your volunteers that they shouldn't disturb asbestos. It's when asbestos becomes airborne and inhalant that it's at risk to your volunteers. Lead is a hazard when inhaled or ingested and can be found in paint and in piping. It is when the paint or pipes are sanded or grinded and becomes airborne that it is a hazard. Silica is the grinding of things like cement or anything that contains gypsum. Again, this is an inhalant hazard. Mold is the most present hazard in a muck and gut operation. Even though mold exists in our environment every day, it's when it becomes an overgrowth and lets off an abundance of spores that it becomes a hazard. You can see some examples of mold overgrowth in flooded homes. Sewage may be present in flood waters. You should always assume that the water is contaminated. That also means that anything that the floodwaters have touched is also contaminated. You should take caution not to touch the area and then touch your eyes, nose, or mouth, which are transmission points. As we move on, we're going to talk about flood response personal protective equipment. As you can see here, to the left, we have a dust mask, and that is not appropriate personal protective equipment. It's not an appropriate respirator. To the right, you have a NIOSH-rated N95 respirator. This is most commonly used for flood response. This is a disposable respirator, which can be thrown away after use each day. To the lower left-hand side, you have a P100 respirator. This is used in flood response for extended work when someone's working for a few weeks at a time, or an environment where there might be oily substances. To the right, you can see a full PPE suit, starting with waterproof boots, coverall. You have gloves. I would assume that there's two gloves underneath there. One, a latex glove or nitrile glove to protect against moisture and chemicals used to gut the home. And then you have a glove on top of that to protect from punctures and cuts. Moving up, you have the P100 respirator, or in some cases you'll see the N95, goggles, and a hard hat. And that's your full PPE. This is a list of tools used in a muck and gut operation: a 3-gallon bucket, crowbar, pry bar, box cutter, hammer, garden sprayer, mold remediation solution, construction grade garbage bags, first aid kit, and forms. You might also want to add in a wheelbarrow, which you can see in the slide previously, as a great helper. This is our muck and gut checklist. If you've never done a muck and gut operation, I would suggest that you take our 4-hour comprehensive flood response training. Serves as a nice overview. So before you even begin your work, confirm you're at the right address and speaking with the homeowner. A renter or family member that's not on the lease can never sign off on a muck and gut operation on a home they don't own. You want to make sure that all forms and releases are signed. You'll conduct a walkthrough with your buddy, again, walking through the home to look for those hazards and review the work order. Before work begins, you'll make sure to turn off utilities, ventilate the work area to release any buildup of mold spores or toxins. While you do so, use your eyes, ears, and nose to see if there are any hazards. You will contain contaminated area. In other words, if you're working on the first and second floor and the third floor is clean, you'll want to put up plastic sheeting to protect that area. You'll use wet methods to dampen down mold spores and other potential airborne hazards. Remove all the items such as couches, books, furniture, curtains, anything that gets in the way of a muck and gut operation. Then you'll remove carpets and padding, and you'll take a look at where the flood water has risen to inside the home. Above that flood line, you'll go an additional 12 inches up and then remove the sheetrock. Sometimes groups will actually cut the sheetrock up into the individual sheets that it comes in so that the rebuild is a little bit easier. You'll make sure to remove all insulation and all cabinets and tiles that have been exposed to the flood waters. After the area is completely gutted, you'll remove all nails. You may allow the area to dry out naturally, or if you start to see that mold growth is growing, you would spray all exposed beams with a mold-killing solution or a borax dishwashing detergent / water solution. A muck and gut operation may take several days. It's important to go through your assessment safety checklist each time you enter the home. Review your work order. Walk through with a safety officer the entire home to ensure that new hazards haven't presented themselves. Make sure all the utilities are still turned off. Come out, brief your team, and discuss how to avoid the hazards. Decide once again that the home is safe to do the work in. Review your roles. Test and put on your PPE. Begin your work. Remember to take breaks, hydrate, and do a safety check. Is everybody still feeling well? Are they using their PPE? Do they need to take a break? Remember to decontaminate before eating and at the end of shift. Clean the equipment with soap and water and remove PPE. Also, always remember to debrief with your team, discussing what's happened throughout the day, how you're feeling physically and emotionally. Not all homes will need mold suppression, but some may, and you're going to identify mold by sight, smell, and a moisture reading. You'll close off the area with plastic sheeting, mist or dampen and scrub the mold. Remove excess mold from the areas that you see and behind the beams, under the flooring, and all areas where mold can be present. You'll heat and dry the home and do a test for moisture. You'll do that with a moisture meter, and you'll measure stud moisture, which should be no more than 16% before rebuild can begin. Only after this process has been conducted and the moisture reading is reading 16% or less should rebuilding begin. If a home is rebuilt before it dries out properly, you're creating an environment for mold to regrow, and the process may have to be repeated. A proven household mold suppression fluid is detergent and borax in water. So 1 cup of, say, Cascade to 1/8 of a cup of borax mixed in 1 gallon of water. And we would put that in Ziploc bags and give it to the volunteers with their bucket and all the equipment they needed for the day. Remember, use a moisture meter to see if the beams and the home is ready for rebuild. So there are push pins on the moisture meter that go into wood beams. Take the reading halfway down and in several places. The front of the beams, the studs, will dry out faster than the back, and the bottom will be the last thing to dry out. So make sure to take your moisture reading at the bottom of the studs. The last step will be to decontaminate both you and your tools. Wash your tools and protective equipment in soap and water. Wash your clothing separately than family laundry, and run a safety wash after you run through your work clothing. That would be 1 cup of bleach run through the machine as a normal wash without anything in it. Remember to store your personal protective equipment properly. If you're not using a disposable respirator and you're using a permanent one, make sure to decontaminate it, dry it, and then place it in a Ziploc bag for storage. We've reached the end of our training, and we'd like to thank you and Rutgers University School of Public Health and the National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences for supporting this training. Please stay connected at worldcares.org and access our free online training at disastervolunteerismacademy.org. Also, join the conversation at readyresponders.org.